I am so inspired by the last session, some of the ideas that came bubbling up, especially with the idea of lived experience, right? So what are children's lived experiences around quality? What are program providers? And really, how does the experience of the child and the family get touched by the kinds of quality ratings you're going to be looking at? And this idea of that focus gets to this idea of measure what you treasure, right? It's the Bob Pianta line that really led to a lot of what happened in Head Start and the use of the class in Head Start. And really thinking about what's proximal to children. So what we're going to talk a lot about in this session is how the standards reflect your ideas of quality and your ideas for what children's outcomes should be. We're not going to, we have a bunch of slides that, again, you'll be able to look at on your own more carefully, but you know all this. We didn't see a large association between standards and outcomes. We have to ask ourselves why, across all of the states, also here in Delaware. And one of the things we can do is start at what we think the highest level should be, right? How can we sort of work downward from there and visioning from there? So we'll be looking at some of the associations between what the highest levels are and children's outcomes and findings across the states, and really think about how to better align what we're going to be saying are the standards and the goals we want to get to around child outcomes. So that's really the goal for the session. We talked, the rest of this morning, we talked a lot about this question of access. Is that the overall goal? Quality improvement, moving up, that's an overall goal. But then again, we're thinking about this idea of children. So when I say alignment, when you say better align the standards to targeted child outcomes, what does that evoke for you? What are you thinking about when we think about alignment? How about things related to content, right? And we think about the areas that were measured in the RAND study, the different outcomes for the children. What does that mean when you think about alignment of quality standards to that? And same thing too for thinking about curriculum, right? Like just having a curriculum is a great thing, but what about that curriculum? Is it aligned with where you want to go with your outcomes for children? And how does that get measured, right? How do you know if any old good curriculum, I have a curriculum, it's on my shelf, as opposed to I use it, it covers these things, I do spend time on mathematics, I do spend time on science, if that's where we want to go. All right, so let's talk about what we know from states, right? So in the past, back in 2011, there were really not that many elaborations of the components of the highest level of quality, right? So that's what we found when we looked at we did a case study of a number of states. But as we've gone out more recently, what we're really finding is that it has broadened because people do want to know what are those important parts out at the high level rating. So that's just a general historical trend that we've seen. And part of this variation is related to the complexity of what we're trying to measure and understand, right? So what should those components be? All right. And when we think about this question, we think about things we've talked about before. Structural quality, process quality. And we know that when you get the highest level ratings, it's really often pushed by that environment rating score, right? So we're saying we want you to be at the highest level quality, whether it's a 5 on the class and so on. And that's how a lot of the systems are rated, right? So if you have a 3 on the ERS, you get a 3. If you have a 4 on the, so that's the categories we put them in. Why are they there? We don't exactly know. There wasn't a lot of history behind it. Someone did a lot of going around and talking to states, and that's what they told them to do, and that's what states tried. But the question really is, how does the higher level of quality components, where do they enter into the rating system? And we're going to look at that a little next. And, the bottom line is you need generally these higher level scores to move up. All right. So this slide has a lot of information in it. What you're looking at across the left-hand side are the different kinds of quality components. And the ones that have asterisks are the more structural ones, right? So class size, group size, health promotion, workforce qualifications, those are the ones with the red stars over there. And what you're looking at to the right is in the 9-state study Gretchen and other folks led, is they're really looking at where do these components, which levels do they come into in the rating system. So these colorful bars are level 1, 2, 3, and so on across. And what you're seeing is I think, really not that surprising, right? So, something like childcare licensing and compliance, level 1 enters there, right? What about some of the other things? See accreditation there, 4th up from the bottom. Some of the states have it in level 2, some level 4, and then some level 5. The other thing to be noticing about this graph is that this is telling you, of the 9 states, how many even had this thing, right? So when we look at it, health promotion and safety, it was 6 states of the 9 that included that in their components and ratings. And this goes back to something we were talking about before, is, Delaware, from the very beginning, always, in my sense, and you guys are used as an example all the time in research discussions, your floor of quality with your licensing is often much higher than other states, right? So they have to put some of those other things in there that you already have incorporated in your entry level for STARS. So that's something to be thinking about too. But I think some of these things, like cultural and linguistic diversity, are coming in at level 2 and level 3, for example, in a number of the states, but a whole bunch of them don't have that. So one of the things to be thinking about, again, is like, what are you going to value? What are you going to put into those buckets? And where do they come into your system? At what level are they going to be coming into your system? Look at the curriculum for a second too. So the use of this kind of goes back to what I was saying before, use of a developmentally appropriate curriculum. 8 of the 9 states have that in there. But again, where it enters is really variable. And we can think about why that might be and think about the lessons for Delaware as well as we unpack a little bit more about this. Okay, so part of the problem that we might be thinking about why we don't see those strong associations between rating levels and child outcomes, the validation of the levels, and so on, could be because we haven't set those bars high enough. We haven't reached high enough for what's in those higher level components. And that goes to something we were talking about before, Becky and Judy were talking about, the complexity issue. Like, we've often put a lot of things in there, but because we're trying to make our best bets. But again, like, as we start to narrow and start to think about what it might be, the question is really, what is it that we require to get to a certain child outcome? We know that from a lot of research, from Peg Birchinall, from folks at Mathematica as well, that this idea of a threshold for quality, probably around a 5, the active range people call it, a 5 and up, is what seems to be most related to child outcomes. That's not so surprising, but think again about what we were just talking about. So many of our programs are not that. Right, so what do we need to do to get folks up there in that active range and continue to move folks? I love the idea that, our theory of change, from Pennsylvania is always going this way, where the bar is going to come up on the bottom and it's going to also rise on the top so that we can keep moving folks towards excellence. Yeah, so it's a question of what do we put in there and are we setting the bar too low? And I think the tricky part for us as researchers too, and working with states, is thinking about we're often just looking within a classroom at an intervention and see what happens. Coaching. Did coaching have an effect on quality in these classrooms and then on children overall? But I think the complexity that you all are faced with, we all are faced with, is, like you're saying, how much weight gets put on those things as opposed to everything else? And the streamlining can really help with that, right? Coming up with a smaller number of the things you'd put your biggest bets on. And that's really what we're trying to get you thinking about today. Let's go to the next slide here. You all know this, right? But we just wanted to show it to you. Where is Delaware as far as the mid-range of quality? Most of the programs are in that mid-range, 3s and 4s and 5s. A much smaller number are low, and folks aren't really making it up on average to that highest level. But what I want you to look at is those stars within each bar. So this is the class pre-K classroom organization, emotional support and instructional support across there. So it's out of 7. But what you're seeing is a huge range across. So in class organization, you've got folks from all the way from under 2 to all the way up over 6. So it is happening, and it gets to the questions we were talking about before. Who is an example for excellence, and what is going on down here at the lower levels? But this is what you're sort of seeing as far as your distributions go, and that's something to be keeping in mind. Again, like, what do we think quality is with regard to our process measures, and then how does that translate into our overall ratings? Okay. This is another example of that. We won't go into this so deeply, but in the best of all possible worlds, from not in stars all the way up to star 5, you'd kind of want to see like a nice going up, right? A relationship between the star rating and the instructional support, for example. That's what you're looking at here. But we're not really seeing that stair-stepping. We would love to have seen that in the RAND study. And then the other thing we're not seeing all that much is that there's a difference between not in stars and some of the lowest levels of ratings and higher levels. So that's what those brackets are showing you, which contrasts are statistically significant. And what we see here, for example, in starting with stars at the 1 and 2 levels, you know, it is different from star 5, the 2 and the 2.5. But again, it's a half of a point, right? What does a half of a point translate into? And those are the important things we need to be talking about. Some people think that you need like maybe a whole point, and there have been some findings related to that we'll talk about in a second. So the other thing that we wanted to show you, this is a seven-site study by Catherine Taud and others at Child Trends, is what are these domains that we're looking at with regard to how children are doing, how many examined those domains, and then how many had significant associations. What you see in the red are the things where Delaware has looked at these things and did not find differences in language and literacy, math, executive function, as we talked about, but we have seen some differences then in social emotional skills. So look first in that first column, how many states actually looked at these things? That's the number there out of the 7. And then how many had significant associations? This is, again, just what we've been saying all along. We're not in the first round or first set of grantees that were studied in depth. We are not seeing that many differences in the association with child outcomes. Okay? So what about this better alignment? What are we going to do to align things more closely? When we think about these two questions, why aren't associations stronger between ratings and observed quality, between ratings and child outcomes, our potential answers have specific implications, really strong implications for how you're going to redesign your system, right? So one could be that the standards aren't capturing the kinds of quality we want. They're just not getting there. There may be too many extraneous things. Maybe so much at this level and not at the classroom level. So that would mean we need to focus and define the standards much more tightly and what the literature says towards the child outcomes. And similarly, when we're thinking about those child outcomes, it would mean that we want to identify the outcomes you think are most important for children, which we're going to take a couple minutes to talk about at the end of this session. And you want to make sure that you get the quality ones that are most aligned from the research. Again, like what is it that is the secret sauce that we think, and where would we put our bets? Is it something where we have to say, okay, if you are really valuing these social emotional outcomes, these language and speaking, communications outcomes we just talked about before, what is it that you're going to have to put in the standards to make that happen? That's our big question for this session and going on into the rest of the afternoon. And hopefully that will stimulate, a lot of thinking on your part after this. This is a very detailed depiction of something that is really interesting. It's that really when we think about the associated outcomes, that's what's the components on the left. So we have staff-child ratio and group size, use of a developmentally appropriate curriculum, quality of the environment, and staff qualifications. Again, in the study that Gretchen led of the 9 states, this is the number out of 9 that included those components. Okay, not so surprising. These are pretty typical. These are the kinds of indicators that they used. Maximum ratios, maximum number of group size, things under developmental curriculum, teacher training in the curriculum. That was the other thing, not just that you have one, but you have actually trained teachers to use it. Quality of the environment, as we all know, is usually in ERS. You have other measures as well, class and so on. And then the staff quals have many, many perturbations, right? Like there's a lot of things people are measuring with regard to staff qualifications. So on the far right then is the total number of states with these specific indicators. So the indicators are what we're using to measure, and then off to the side. And the ones with asterisks are what you're using, what Delaware is using in the far right-hand side. And again, we have to ask ourselves, so These are the things that have been found to be associated with child outcomes in the literature, in the broader literature. And we bring that information back into decision making about what to put into the revision standards, right? So what are the kinds of things that you might take from the general literature on associations between different components of quality and outcomes? So what do we take away from some of these pieces around your job in measuring quality? And I always joke with state folks, I'm like, you are measures developers, right? With all the rights and responsibilities that takes, you know, thinking about what the components are going to be. So what reduces validity? What causes a QRIS and any measure really not to be valid? Well, one of the things that I mentioned before is this low bar, right? That we don't have enough sort of variability across the levels. And the question is, again, I think some folks have in the past felt kind of shy about making that bar go higher, right? Because it leaves people out, it makes it more scary. But again, if we're living in the CQI 2.0 kind of world, we have to develop this culture of safety, right? We have to have people feel like, yes, it's high stakes, yes, money is involved, but I need to be able to be honest with myself as far as our total ownership of the goal. We want to get to better quality and we want to get to better child outcomes. The reality, here's where I am, and here's how I see a path to getting to quality. So what does that look like? And I have to feel safe in that, and I think folks mentioned that earlier before. But it does have an effect on where we set that bar. And the other point really is that these multiple components can get all mishmashed, right? The validity will decrease if there's a lot of overlap. And what we need to do then is we need to make sure, and one of the things that the literature is saying, what I was saying before, is that measuring interaction and the physical environment seems to be among the biggest predictors of outcomes, although we know they're not perfect on the side, I'll just say that. And the question is what domains, and I already hit on that quite a bit, right? If you want to do the language and communication, you've got to have it into your standards. What is that going to be like? And how would you go about doing that? And then thinking about these thresholds in a more thoughtful way. What does the literature say to us? And what would we expect? You know, part of what we are doing now a lot in what I would call CQI 2.0 is having people really think about what is reasonable? What do I expect to make a difference? And how do you put your bets on that and make your measurement go towards that? So the other thing that we wanted to mention too is the other set of considerations is really about which skills are predictive to later outcomes. So the communications area, you know, if you're talking to Greg Duncan, you know, he's like, it has to be about math. It has to be about cognitive skills. Where does that all fit into the larger picture here? And you want to be able to track that performance. You want to be able to see those changes over time. And that also has been a hard nut for a lot of QRISs if the quality rating is so far apart in time, whether it's 3 years in some cases and so on. Again, related to affordability, related to what the burden is on providers. What we really do want is we want measures that are predictive of later development. They're low burden, but they do a good job at getting at these thresholds for the outcomes we care about. And they track performance across all ages, right? They track performance in infant toddler, in pre-K, and in school age. So what we're going to do is we are going to think about your primary outcomes. Some folks already threw some of those out in the form of what would children be doing, what would providers be doing if I went into a high quality classroom. So if you have your stickies out in front of you, think about, you know, here you have your domains of focus already laid out in your learning foundations. What would the child outcomes be that you want to see in 5 years? I love the 5-year time frame because it feels more tangible, but it also helps us push out. Like it feels more, you know, 1 year seems like a long time to make a big difference, but 5 you could see yourself making a big difference. So first, which child outcomes should stars be most associated with in 5 years? What would you put your bets on? How will you know there's a change in those outcomes? What would you want to see different? And what are the right measures? What are you wanting to see? We certainly want to see changes in every child who's in a high quality center. We want them to be improving, right? And there are different ways to think about doing that, whether it's the triennial formative assessments, say in Head Start, or triannual, you know, and so on. That's more in the formative realm. There are things like Martha's talking about. What do you need to do as far as a study? What kind of evidence do I need to do what kind of response and when? So this is what I just want to put out here on the table. This is potentially our recommendation for next steps, right? How do you go forward and get on the same page, get the buy-in that you need to be able to have those conversations and really think about when do I need to say to the legislature, to the governor, to ourselves, I have to know if something has changed in child outcomes and how and at what level. And again, thinking about population-based measures, you can think about things that might come in at age 2. Child Trends and other folks through a Pritzker initiative have been working on coming up with an idea. So with folks in Canada, what would that look like for an age 2 population-based measure? What is something that you have at kindergarten entry? That's why the whole kindergarten entry assessment movement started to happen. And then what is grade 3? I mean, what parts of grade 3 do you care about, and so on.